The next up is David Drip.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Just want to give a quick update on a couple things related to revaluation and our assessed value projections. I won't go into as much of an in-depth discussion as we did earlier this week, but just a few points on from our analysis of results from the revaluation. So we just completed our sales ratio report from the last year, which identifies a random sample from the Department of Revenue to look at our sales analysis over the course of last year's sales. And that's the comparison between sales price and our assessed value in the revaluation. So our results on that were a mean ratio of 97.9, median ratio of 98.4. So that means we are right at below market. Our assessments are just below the sales prices of property, almost near that 100% standard, so what we're trying to reach. And our standard deviation on that was right at 5%. So I did an analysis here for you to see of sales transactions that we've identified and qualified since January 1st. So this is after the point of our revaluation, just to show once we've identified those values, we can then track our progress over the course of this next year to see how our results were. Certainly, it's easy to do a revaluation and change values to the sales that are taking place, but our model is used to project what the value would be January 1st, and these recent sales that have been taking place give a good example of where we are and how we did. So with 123 qualified sales between January 1 and January 22 of this year, we're at a sales ratio of 94.2, a median sales ratio of 94.7. So that indicates, with our goal being 100%, we're a little below market value from with these sales that have taken place. Our coefficient of dispersion is 6.4. Our ideal is to be between 5 and 10%. And our price-related differential, which is an indication of price bias between lower value properties and higher value properties, is well within the range, close to 1 as we need to be. So anything outside the range of 0.97 to 0.103 is an indication of an issue, and we're certainly within that range. Just wanted to show this as an example of some good results that we see from sales that have taken place since January 1st, our revaluation date. So once again, just to recap, we did show this in the meeting the other night. We are currently in the appeals process. This first level of appeal is the informal appeals process. This period is open until April 18th. So this is our opportunity to hear from our taxpayers, address any concerns that we've identified, any concerns that they have. We can show the information that we have. We can show the methodology we use to get to that valuation. And we can review any concerns that they have and information that they can provide. We've currently got about 1,600 appeals that have been submitted. That's about 1.5%. We don't know where we're going to end up with the significant change in value. We expect a higher volume of appeals than we have typically seen in previous revals. I can tell you our last reval in 2020, we had a little over 3.2% appeals. So we're halfway to that point at this level, and I'm sure we'll get more in. We expect a higher volume this year. So,
David,
Sure.
can we go back to that previous slide just for a minute? You moved too fast for me. On the average sales ratio, obviously the goal is to be at 100% market value. Is that correct?
yes, sir.
And we are at 94.2%. Now, obviously the new assessment is not in these figures.
So this is a comparison to our new revaluation assessment that was done effective January 1. And these are sales that have taken place since that date. So ideally, our values January 1, 2024, we're at 100%. These are sales that have taken place since that time, and we'll track this throughout the progress of the next 4 years. But what this shows, I think, from our Department of Revenue analysis that showed we were at 98% as our results of the reval, this is showing a continuous trend of market values that are continuing to be above our evaluation. So
Okay, I just wanted to clarify it, not only for myself, but for those.
this will change over time as we continue to analyze sales that take place over the course. I think we talked a little bit on Monday night. The further we get from a revaluation date, the more you're going to see that difference in sales ratio change. Right, because the reval is an identification of market value as of that one point in time. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So one of the main reasons we track this and we report to the Department of Revenue is that, as Mr. Harris just indicated, there is the statute that requires we do revaluations. We've talked about that they're required every 8 years. We have the option the commissioners have the option to advance that schedule. You all have advanced that to a 4-year schedule, but there's an additional piece to that statute that requires, if the county drops below this sales ratio report that we do from the Department of Revenue with a random sample of sales, if that is below a ratio of 85%, then that requires a mandatory advancement of the next reappraisal. So at any point in our Department of Revenue sales ratio reporting, these ratios drop below 85%. We're then required to do a revaluation within the next 3 years. So that's the importance of tracking this on a regular basis. It makes sure, even though the statute allows potentially 8 years before revaluation, the effects of the market could trigger that to be a more an advancement of that date to within 3 years. So using a 4-year schedule as we do, that's never been a concern because our first year reporting, even if we're below 85%, it would require a reappraisal within 3 years, which is our current schedule anyway. So that's not been a concern in the past, but that could be, if the decision was ever made to change our 4-year cycle, that could be something that needs to be considered.
So, David, what was our percentage last year when you ran these computations?
Prior to doing the revaluation and changing our assessments, we were below 60, in the 50% range.
So
our values last year compared to our 2020 assessment essentially was about 50% of the market value in the county.
So if we had not already been scheduled to do a revaluation, we would have been forced to schedule one? Is that what I'm hearing?
So that mandatory advancement would have been required for next year. So 2025, we would have been required by that standard to do a revaluation.
Because it had changed that much.
We've gone below the 85% at the end of 2020.
So if we'd run into a situation like that, and we would have been mandated to do that in 2025, and I understand that the process takes, how long does the process take? It takes well over a year. Is that correct?
So the notification, and that's the reason for that the way it's set up. Once we hit the 85 threshold, if we make that number, Department of Revenue, based on that reporting that we do, will notify us that we're required to do that evaluation within a 3-year period from that date that we hit it. So that happened in 2020. We were 2021, so we would be required to do it by 2025 had we not already had scheduled a 2024 review. So if that happens this year, at the end of this current year, and we're beyond that 85% threshold, we would be required to do in a 3-year period, which would be our currently scheduled 2028 anyway. So with a 4-year evaluation schedule, that mandatory investment doesn't come into play. If we extend beyond that is when that can be potential. Any other questions on that?
They might just crash it and it's death and that way.
Yeah, so that would be, thank you for that. That would be 15% at 85% or 115%. So any scale of 15% away from that 100% of value on our sales ratio would trigger a mandatory advance. So just quickly for what you'll be getting into later this evening and into tomorrow, looking at our projection of total value for property tax valuation. This is our current estimate, and I wanted to show this and give some detail because this is the amount of things we are currently estimating and what we'll be going through over the next couple months to try to determine exactly where these numbers will end up. So this is not a final number. It's just a point in which we're at to be able to make some estimation. So a total property market value of $46.3 billion. And then we have to account for what of that is deferred through our present use value farm programs, those deferred programs. We have to look at what property is excluded by the 3 types of exclusions we talked about Monday night. We have to look at what is deferred under the builder's inventory exclusion. We have to estimate what property exemptions are. We know what's out there and exempted now, but the period to apply is through the end of January, so there could be new exemptions we have to account for, and all of these have new applications. So these are numbers that we are currently estimating and working through the process of identifying what the final number is going to be. So, and then the big numbers, what could change between now and the end of our appeals period. We have to account for the potential that this, with a significant amount of change, we expect a significant number of appeals, and therefore the potential for adjustment is there in this process, and we need to account for that. So our total estimate right now of real property value, taxable value, is going to be $40,696,510,821. And that will, without question, change over the course of the next couple of months. That is, however,
Could you give us some, while you were on that other slide, some examples? That's $3 billion of exemptions. Could you give some examples of what those exemptions are?
Sure. So exempt property is anything owned by any government within the county, anything that's exempted through, there's a number of statutes that exempt property. The most we think about are churches that are exempt, hospitals, government property. So anything that is exempt fully from property tax by statute, we have to account for that. We still value that property. It's part of our assessment, but those don't result in a tax bill if they're exempt from property tax. That's what that category is.
Okay.
So the real estate is just, of course, a piece, as Jim mentioned earlier, of the total property estimate that we put together. So we have that real property estimate, personal property, which is primarily business personal property, machinery and equipment, income producing property that's not exempt. So individual personal property, the furniture in your home and things that we own individually is not taxable. That is exempt by statute. But business personal property, income producing property that's not real estate is taxable. And we identify that and expect that to be about $2.7 billion. Public service companies are appraised by the Department of Revenue on, these are companies that have property that extends over multiple jurisdictions. So it's not just a county specific piece of real estate. For example, phone companies, power companies, those entities that have property that exists over large jurisdictions, the Department of Revenue values those on a per unit basis, provides to us the amount of those values in each jurisdiction, and we do the billing and collection for that. And then registered motor vehicles that are valued by our department, but paid and collected through the Department of Motor Vehicles is about $3 billion. So total estimated taxable value for this coming fiscal year is going to be $47 billion in our estimate. So all of those numbers certainly have the potential to change. This is our estimate. So the personal property, if you'll consider that January is the typical listing period for personal property, but the request can be made to extend that to April 15th. So we have until April 15th before we even know what businesses potentially are listing for the year. So this is an estimate at this point based on our historical identification of what we expect to happen. Public service companies are appraised throughout the year. We get that information finalized in September usually, so we won't know the actual number till then, but we have a pretty good estimation based on our historical analysis of what the growth will be for that. And then motor vehicles is even a little more difficult to pinpoint, as that's a monthly transaction that takes place. So if someone buys a vehicle, we have to try to project over the course of the next year and a half from this point what the economic factors will affect the motor vehicle, both valuation and growth within the county across the board. So that is a number also that is an estimate at this point that we'll continue to modify as we get more information in over the course of the years.
Do you know where we sit compared to Mecklenburg County for the total taxable value? Because you're the tax guy, and we hear both sides of that argument. Can you explain kind of where we sit and how that relates? I figure you're the best one to explain it, since that's what you do.
Thank you. I don't have those numbers, but I can certainly find that. So from a comparison standpoint, we're much smaller than Mecklenburg County. I don't have numbers. I wouldn't want to guess at that. We can find that for you and easily identify the comparison there. They have the same 4 categories that they estimate a budget on, so we can easily make that comparison. I just don't have those numbers.
It's a big deal.
Those are the companies that spread over multiple jurisdictions. Utility companies that have a plant that crosses lines. So we don't value those like a single piece of real estate. Those are valued by the Department of Revenue, the entire company from a unit basis, and then they apportion out to each county and municipality what portion of the value of the whole is within that jurisdiction. So that's what I plan to present tonight. I'm certainly open for any other questions if you have them.
Thank you, Logan. That you see about the process I made about.
At this point, I can say that that's what's been submitted. We're in the process of communicating with our taxpayers, answering questions and phone calls. We've worked very little. That'll be a process that takes place over the next couple months.
David, when we talk about sales tax, and if we look at adjusting the sales tax, are we bound by general statute as to what that extra can be used for? And if we are, how do we go about getting permission to use? If we adjust that sales tax, how do we go? Is that a General Assembly or is that a county issue?
I will say that's a good question for Mr. Harris to answer. Property tax I can answer. I'd try to stay away from.
So the sales tax that is currently available to us is a 1/4 cent additional sales tax that has to be used for transit purposes. That would require a public referendum on a ballot. Any additional sales tax beyond that would require an act of the General Assembly to authorize it, and that would be up to them whether they would do so.
Do we have a time frame? If they were to approve us to be able to say, put that towards education, do we have a time frame of how long that would take to be put? Can they put anything in their short session, or?
I would have to look at the details of a sales tax referendum in terms of the timeline. It would have to be a countywide election in order for it to happen. So if it couldn't happen in November, for example, it would have to wait until 2026.
Another thing too, we've been trying for years to get the General Assembly to give us flexibility on that 1/4 cent. And like Rodney said, right now it has to be used for transportation, but we would like to have the flexibility to use it for other issues. And that 1/4 cent would generate $12 million for the county to use for other things. But they say we have to use it for transportation, so we hadn't made any progress with that.
Yeah, I think the other question I would ask on that and Commissioner Sue is correct. I think we've been trying for about 8 years to get authorization to have that flexibility on that quarter-cent local option sales tax. But in addition to that, the state has also set a maximum sales tax, which, does anybody know exactly what that is? I think there may have been 1 or 2 counties that were grandfathered on that because they had already exceeded the maximum, but then they established a maximum for every county in the state. Am I correct on that? Do you know what that maximum is? 7.5%. That's what I thought. Yeah, so that is for any county in the state. The other thing to add to that, for those that have been on the board for a while, the last time they enacted that legislation, for some period of time, and I know we went to Raleigh several times to talk with them about it, there was also a redistribution plan that was proposed for those sales taxes. And under that plan, they would take counties like Cabarrus that generate a lot of sales taxes with like Concord Mills and the other things that we have in the county, and they were going to take a portion of the sales tax that we collect in Cabarrus County and redistribute it to some of the poorer counties that did not have as much income in the state. Fortunately, that did not happen, but that's something I think that we always have to be careful and pay attention to, because it could come up again. I think most everybody has heard some of the conversation, and the numbers vary from time to time, but there are 20 counties that are growing and expanding in North Carolina, and 80 counties, roughly, that are flat or losing population and losing revenue. So there is always the potential of legislation, because those 80 counties have got a lot more representation in the General Assembly than the 20 counties do. So that's something that we have to be diligent in paying attention to.
So just real quick on that, since we're on the subject of sales tax, one other thing to keep in mind with it is, as we move through this budget process, and we haven't yet had a chance to put together the calculations, the sales tax distributions are tied to currently the ad valorem value, so property tax value. So as tax rates are set, there will be a redistribution of sales tax revenues among the county and the cities and the towns. And so depending on where our tax rate goes in relation to the cities and the towns, there could be a redistribution that negatively impacts our budget or positively impacts our budget. We'll work on those calculations. And then just to go back to the question about MEC, I pulled it up. It's $281 billion is their assessed value. 281 billion. Ours is 47 billion.
And another thing too, Rodney, that I wanted to mention about the sales tax, it's 7.25% now, and we have the 0.25% available to us. But I done covered that. But the thing that most people don't know, that's the North Carolina state sales tax, and we only get like 2% of the 7.25%. Now, I think that's correct. Is that right, David? Or Rodney, do you know? I mean, we don't get the full 7.25%. We only get about 2% of it. The rest of it goes to the state because it's a state sales tax.
That's all I had. Any other questions?
I'll leave.
One question, David. Some of the, I know you've gone over a couple of times the appeals process on the valuation, and the first step in that is let's talk. Folks that I have communicated with, I've shared that information with them and said, if you do not think that your revaluation figure is accurate market value, then you need to file an appeal and have that investigated. And so a couple people have come to me and said that they inquired about their revaluation and that whoever they spoke to could not give them information about comparable sale. More specifically, they had said, I know of 3 houses in my neighborhood that have sold within the last several months, and none of them sold for as high a value as my property is evaluated on. And so is that part of that informal let's talk conversation that they give them information on those comps, or does that come more in a formal appeal? And I think you also mentioned the other night a tool online where they could go and look at those comparable sales at their leisure. Could you just talk about that a little bit, make sure we got the right facts?
Yeah, so that what we've provided online is the tool that lets people look at sales that have taken place within their area, and they can change those filters to expand that research if they want to. Just a tool to let people do some research on their own for what is happening in the market around. Ideally, we have a number of folks that call our office have kind of a couple different responses. Some of them that don't understand where we came up with the value, and we should be able to help walk them through what our process was and how we've developed that. We may not, within one phone call, be able to cite specific comparables for each person that we talk to. That may be a little bit much of an ask on that initial phone call, but we then should be able to provide that if they're requesting it, or steer them to those resources that we have for them to identify what market transactions have been taking place. We do have folks that then call us with an informal appeal, and they've done that research. They have the information, and we can compare their information with ours and discuss back and forth what's reasonable and what adjustments may need to be made. So the fact that you have multiple houses in your neighborhood that have sold at a different price point than what we valued your house could be from any number of factors. Not every house in a neighborhood is exactly the same, and there's different factors that drive value. So being able to do that comparison and make adjustments for what's specific about your property versus the sales that have taken place is an education process that we should be helping folks go through when they call. So if they've not been getting that information, I'm not sure how to answer that. We should be providing that type of detail. It may be within this first week of responses from notices that from a timing standpoint and taking calls, we hopefully have scheduled other time to do that, because we would like to have that conversation with folks.
And so the primary factors that likely they would be looking at would be lot size, square footage, number of bathrooms, things of that nature. Is that accurate, or is that a little too general?
Yeah, so there's 3 components that we established to value property. We look at land value. The factors that can affect land value are certainly size is a big one of those, but then road frontage, access to utilities. There's any number of adjustments that can be made to our kind of standard base rate based on the specifics of the land that we're talking about. We have the structure, the main structure itself, which we look at. Certainly size and bedroom count is the obvious things people talk about, but there's any number of details that we identify within our database that can adjust that kind of standard value. The type of foundation that is on, the construction of the walls, the roof structure, exterior wall type, interior flooring. The list is pretty expansive and what our schedule of values, as we've talked about, identifies is every piece of that development of that property leads to our model that predicts a valuation for that. So it's not just bedroom count, it's not just square footage, it's the entire package of what that structure is. Additionally, there's a third component, which is anything that's an improvement to the property that's not part of kind of the main house, if you're thinking from a residential standpoint. So a garage that's not attached to the house, or fencing, carports, driveways, things that are improvements that we've identified as add value to property that aren't part of our, this is how we value a house, are part of that component. So that said, there's just a lot of specifics that go into our evaluation. And what we try to do, what we should be doing in that informal process is looking and getting some agreement with the taxpayer that these are the things that we've identified. Is that correct for what is actually on your property? Because that's an easy way to make some correction if we've got it wrong in our initial evaluation, in our initial approach. And once we agree that we're talking about the same property, we're talking about the same factors, then we talk about the market value and the comparison to other properties. So does that answer your question? I don't want to be expensive, but there's more than just a simple, these are the 2 or 3 things we look at.
Yes, I think it does. And so as far as evaluating the, and I'm not all that knowledgeable about it, let's say the type of floors in the house. There would be, if you had a concrete floor, it would be one value. If you had hardwood floors, another. You don't actually go in and look at these structures. It would, you said 97,000 of them. So how do those factors come into play?
So we do physically look at every property as it's being built, that we're aware of it, that it's being built. So we try to do that inspection at the point in which construction is taking place so we can identify the bones, what it's being built out of. We've done that for as long as I know we've built our database. So we hopefully have the correct information on all those statistics for each property. But you're right, we don't necessarily have the ability to go in every person's home during a revaluation, and things change over time. So that can be part of the discussion we have during this informal appeal process. There's a listing period every January. We send a letter out to every taxpayer where we request, and by statute, they're required to report those changes that they've made. We realistically get very little response from that, but that is a point in which people are supposed to tell us. Typically, it comes down to the point in which we change value and we have those conversations is when we really identify those changes in data that we have.
So an example of that would be if you went and put in new hardwood floors throughout your house, you're supposed to report that, right?
That's correct. In January of the next year.
Right. And very few people do.
There are some that are good citizens that report correctly.
Right.
But not everyone does. So we track permitting that takes place. We try to identify, using the resources that we have available, changes that are taking place. But that is one of the challenges, and one of the, I think I've mentioned in some of our discussions, that data collection piece is a big part of what we do, and we do that. That isn't a 2-year project. We do that from the point of now until the next revaluation. We're continually collecting data on what's changing within the market.
David, I've been trying to figure out how to ask this question because I want to try to get it where maybe you can help us answer it. But whenever you do, like we heard people talking to us Monday night about, they saying their values were overly inflated, all the different numbers that they throw out at us. When you make, or when the tax office does their reevaluation, do they take consideration? You look at this house here, and this house here is in perfect condition. Got beautiful flowers and beautiful trees. The gutters is not falling off, and you got this one over here where, for whatever reason, has run down. You can tell it needs a lot of work done to it. Is any of that stuff taken into consideration as to value? I mean, in some cases, the house may need $50,000 or $75,000 worth of work to bring it up to what maybe the assessed value might be. And so, how do you guys account for that type thing when you can't do that through the the laptop, but I know you can probably zero in and look. But who does that? Does anybody sit there and look and say, well, how do our gutters look? How does this is the back porch falling off? Things like that do have an effect on value. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, we do take that into consideration. We have to, because that's a big part of the value of property. Certainly a brand new home or a home that's been completely remodeled versus one next door that needs a lot of work is not going to have the same value and shouldn't carry the same value. And that should be reflected in our assessment. We do that through, if you've looked at our property record card, it's kind of a hybrid market and cost approach. But from a cost approach standpoint, our model takes all of those data points we talked about of what the characteristics of the property are to determine what a replacement cost is. So given today's market, what would it take to completely rebuild what that property is based on how it was built initially? And then from there, we need to depreciate from that point based on the current condition and depreciation that's taken place on that property. So that's where the depreciation concept is, where we take into account those factors of condition of a property, whether it's been kept up, whether it hasn't, whether it's been remodeled, whether it hasn't. So that remodel concept could affect the flooring, could affect the floor type, but it could also just affect the effective age of that property. And from an appraisal term, effective age is a big part of our identification of each property, because that sets the depreciation that's accounted for. So specifically, yes, we should be taking every piece of what the market would identify affects value into our consideration as well. So if you think about it from the standpoint of you're going to buy a house, all those things that you consider are what we should be considering when we're doing our evaluation.
I guess that brings up another question. Somebody I was talking to during the week was mentioned how the valuation would impact their homeowner's insurance, which is obviously something that we don't have anything to do with. But I know there were some proposed rate hikes in recent months, and I think those have been put on hold. But my answer to this person was, well, as far as my homeowner's insurance, I want to make sure I'm protected. So if my house burns down, I can build it back. I've got enough coverage to build it back, which would I would assume would be similar factors to what we use in arriving at that valuation. So I guess, I mean, that's one way to find out what it's actually worth if you start building it back, because they'll tell you quickly. So the value that we place for tax purposes on the property, theoretically, is that supposed to be that replacement cost value? As I know you say market value. I mean, I guess in a perfect world, those would be the same thing, but I'm not sure if they are or not.
So I'm not an insurance specialist. So
Right.
I will say that if you're
Obviously, you can tell I'm not either. Yeah.
So if your homeowner's insurance is, if you want to have homeowner's insurance that protects the value of your home, then an appraisal of the property is what's going to be the most properly thing to insure. And that insurance appraisal, looking at a replacement cost, may be fully just a replacement cost, may be a little different than looking at taking that replacement cost and making sure it fits within a market standpoint. But to your point, our assessment and change in tax value doesn't automatically change your homeowner's insurance. Those two things are separate. It depends upon you and your relationship with your homeowner's insurance company as to what you've got insured and the value that you are insuring. So
Right.
I do not have I don't have an effect on that, my
Okay.
assessment. And I don't know that the homeowner's insurance company that's providing insurance would just take our tax value and insure off of that. They would do their own assessment and their own appraisal of the property. So
Great. Thank you.
Back to Lynn's question, we had a man speak Monday night. He talked about his assessed value and how he would have to replace the roof. He would have to do all these things to get that house up to that value. If that man were to come into your office and sit down, are you able to pull up and show him where this is where you gave him credit for that roof? Or is that something that could have been missed? Because we sit there and it's tough to hear those. I 100% see his side. So is it detailed enough to where if he comes in, you can show all the deductions that you've made to get to that value?
yes. So our property record card has it's pretty complex when you look at it, which is good in that we provide all the information out there, but it's bad in that it's a little difficult to read sometimes from a taxpayer standpoint. But it shows all the details that we've identified that are part of the property, and it shows the replacement cost. It shows the depreciation that we've accounted for that and the depreciated value that we are assessing it at. So we can show all of those factors. And if there's something within that conversation that leads us to think we've not accounted for something, that's the type of thing that we can fix under appeal and that we try to identify. So that those are the important conversations we like to have, is to find out if we've identified this property as one that's comparatively with other properties, everyone's rehabbed their homes and they're getting a certain value, and this one hasn't. We need to be able to take that into account and show how we've made that calculation.
He said, I do that here, that I ain't on.
So as I was speaking earlier, land valuation is part of our assessment, and we should be identifying the impact of that on the value of the property. And if we haven't accounted for that, that's something we need to look at. So it depends on whether it adds value. Without seeing the specifics, it's hard to answer that. If it prevents a property from being buildable, it's going to take away value. If it adds value to a property from an aesthetic standpoint, it could add value. It's different for each property. So that would be judged theoretically by the market that we're analyzing. Any other questions? Thank you.
Yeah, how we're gonna